that has Nedarim 9:1 up at the top. That's been provided for your convenience because I suspect no one has a copy of the Talmud with them. For one reason, if for no other reason, the fact that the Talmud is about the size of the 7 encyclopedias.
That's true.
So, when I was here before, we got into some conversation, and in our conversation, we got to talking about the traditions of men, and so we started talking about some things of those aspects, and so I thought today I would talk about Matthew chapter 15, and there's also a parallel in Mark chapter 9, which is the only place where Yeshua actually talks about anything he calls traditions of men. And so I want to actually examine what Yeshua really says in these verses and show you that it's not what you probably have been told that he was saying. Okay? And in the process, we're going to get your feet wet in a little bit of actual, real Talmud stuff. Okay? And so I provided you the relevant little section of Talmud that we'll be discussing. Starting in Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 9. And then came near to him scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem, saying, Why do your Talmudim transgress the decrees of the elders? For they clean not their hands when they eat bread. But he answered them and said, Why do you transgress the commandments of Elohim by means of your decrees? Is it not written in your Torah from the mouth of Elohim, Honor your father and your mother? That's Exodus 20:12 and Deuteronomy 5:16, by the way. And moreover, it is written, And he that curses his father and his mother will surely die. Exodus 21:17 and Leviticus 29. But you say that whoever says to his father and his mother, It is korban, whatever of mine might profit you. And he honors not his father and his mother. Thus have you made void the commandments of Elohim on account of your judgments. You hypocrites, Yeshayahu did well indeed to prophesy concerning you, saying, This people honors me with their mouth and with their lips, but they have removed their heart far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment learned of men. Isaiah 29:13. Okay, so let's examine what the Talmud actually says about this specific issue and find out if Yeshua is agreeing with the Talmud or disagreeing with the Talmud, and whether the Talmud then is the traditions of men Yeshua is speaking of. So the relevant section of Talmud here is in the Mishnah, Nedarim 9:1. Now the Talmud has two parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah was compiled around 200 CE, and the Gemara was compiled about 300 years later, around 500 CE, at least the Babylonian Gemara, there's two. There's the two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, because there were two major centers of Judaism at the time. There was one, wasn't actually at Jerusalem, but it was near Jerusalem in the land, it was associated with Jerusalem. And there was another that was in the land that had been the land of the Babylonian captivity. Because when Ezra and Nehemiah brought a group of Jews back, they didn't bring nearly all of them. In fact, they only brought a minority back. In fact, the book of Esther takes place after that, and the book of Esther takes place in Persia, in the land of the Babylonian captivity. Okay? Up until fairly recent times, one of the largest Jewish communities in the world lived in that area where is Iraq today. Now I know today it's absurd to think that a Jew would be caught dead, because that's almost the only way he might be caught,
There is.
in modern Iraq.
Yeah.
But 100 years ago or 150 years ago, there was a huge Jewish community in that area that dated back to over 2,000 years. Okay? And so, after the Mishnah was written, the commentary from the rabbis that were after that time was compiled in the Gemara, and there were two. The first was compiled in Jerusalem about 400, not in Jerusalem, but in the land in the west around 400 CE, and that was actually done as sort of a rush job because the Roman Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which was at this time synonymous with the Roman Empire, had really come down hard on Judaism, and they were afraid that if they didn't get these traditions written down, there wouldn't be enough Jews left in the region that knew them. They'd be lost forever. So they wrote them down. And they did so in a hurry because of the conditions they were under. Whereas the Babylonian Talmud was written down 100 years later, and it's considered the superior of the two. It's the one that we usually refer to when we refer to the Talmud because they had access to the Jerusalem Talmud and because they had more time. They were able to just compile it at their leisure. Okay, so the Mishnah, the first portion, we have here in Deuteronomy 9:1 says, Rabbi Eliezer says, they open a vow for a man by reference to the honor of his father or mother. Okay? Now, the Talmud is written very concisely and in almost cryptic language that you really have to learn and get the hang of. So it just starts out very abruptly. Rabbi Eliezer says, they open a vow for a man by reference to the honor of his father or his mother. To open a vow or to loose a vow means that they nullify the vow. Okay? The issue here is that there were different kinds of vows that a person would make. One of them that's particularly relevant here, would be if I was to say, if I had, let's say I had a candy bar in my hand, and I was to say, this candy bar will be to me prohibited to me. Well then, and if I took that as a vow, then I would be violating my vow if I eat the candy bar. Okay. Now, there came a system whereby there was a vow that could be taken by allegory, where I would say, this candy bar will be to me as the offering on the altar. And then the candy bar would be still prohibited to me because the offering on the altar is prohibited to me, right? So if the offering on the altar is prohibited to me, then the candy bar is prohibited to me. Now the offering on the altar is called karban in Hebrew, okay, offering. And so if a person was to say this candy bar is karban, it would mean I would be taking a vow that said this candy bar is prohibited to me. Okay, and I would be breaking my vow if I ate it. Now, a more complex situation would be that if I was angry at someone, okay, and then I said, I was angry at Ed. And I said, may anything of Ed's that I might benefit from is korban to me. I want nothing to do with it. Then that would be a vow, and I would be breaking my vow then if I had any association with Ed. If Ed offered me something, gave me something, I would have to turn it away. Okay? I might also say something like korban if I enter his home, meaning I'm prohibited from entering his home. Okay. So you understand sort of the background. Now, if a person wanted to be released from a vow, there was really only one way you could be released from a vow. And the one way you could be released from a vow, at least the primary way, was if that vow was given or made in error. And the classic example that's given in the Talmud of the vow that's made in error is the husband who thought his wife stole some money. And so he's angry, and he takes a vow, and he says, Korban, if I benefit anything from you. So he puts this gulf up between himself and his wife. And then later, silly man, he finds where he put the money. Oh man, do I feel stupid. I got all angry and I made this vow, and she didn't steal the money after all. But he already made the vow. So does that mean that he can't have anything to do with the wife now that he knows that it was a mistake? Well, the answer to that is no. He can be released from the vow, but he can't just do it himself, okay? Because everyone saw him make the vow, or everyone knows that he made this vow. And so if they saw him breaking the vow, he'd be breaking the vow. So what he would do is he would go to the Beit Din, to the court, and he would ask the court, the sages, to release him from his vow and issue a decree that his vow is nullified. Loose the vow. Okay. And they would then ask him to testify, to state, what we would say on penalty of perjury. If you knew then what you know now, would you still make the vow? In other words, you made the vow apparently because you were ignorant of the facts. But if you knew the facts, if you knew the truth then, if you knew then what you know now, would you have made the vow? And if the person could honestly testify and say, I would not have made this vow if I had known then what I know now. I only made the vow in ignorance because I was misled as to the facts. Then he would be loosed from the vow. And so Rabbi Eliezer comes along and he says, find a place here. They open a vow for a man by reference to the honor of his father and his mother. So Rabbi Eliezer says, if the guy comes into court and he says, I want to be loosed from my vow because the fact that I made a vow, it was considered a sort of a disreputable thing to do. The reason, hot-headed or whatever. The reason that the fact that I made a vow dishonors my parents. And so I have a problem here. Sometimes we have to have a conflict between which commandment do we follow. The classic example that's given is circumcision. Okay? A child is supposed to be circumcised on the 8th day, but one child at 7, the 8th day is going to be a Sabbath. So do we use tools and do work to perform a circumcision on the Sabbath? Yes, because the circumcision outweighs the Sabbath. Same thing with the burnt offerings in the temple. They perform burnt offerings in the temple on the Sabbath. Kindling fire and using tools and doing all of those things would normally have violated Sabbath. But the burnt offerings, the commandment to perform the burnt offerings, outweighs the commandment to keep the Sabbath. So there's all this different priority of commandments. So I have a dilemma. Do I keep the commandment that says to keep my vows, or do I keep the commandment that says not to dishonor my parents? That's the conflict that comes up. And so Rabbi Eliezer says if the man comes into court and he says, I wish to be released from my vow because I wouldn't make the vow because it dishonors my parents. Is that a valid reason to loose the vow? Well, the next line says, and the sages prohibit. Now, the sages is a term that's used in the Mishnah to mean the majority. Okay? The Chachamim, the sages. This is why I said it's kind of confusing to study Talmud if you don't know some things, because if you're reading in the Gemara, you'll often read a phrase, our rabbis taught. And when you see that phrase, our rabbis taught, it doesn't mean the majority. So there's a big difference between the phrase, our rabbis taught, and the sages say. But you wouldn't know that if you didn't know the traditions that are built into understanding the Talmud. Okay, so the sages, they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. They say, we don't loose a vow in that situation. We don't loose a vow like that. Okay, then Rabbi Zadok comes along. Rabbi Zadok says, before they open a vow for him by reference to his father or mother, let them open his vow by reference to the honor of Hamakom. Hamakom is a euphemism for Elohim. Okay, so it says, if we're going to loose a vow for a man by reference to the fact that the vow dishonors his father and his mother, then why not loose a vow for a man because it dishonors Elohim? Now the next line of our Mishnah is a very controversial one because there are 4 different ways to interpret it. We'll talk about the first 2 right now. We'll get to the next 2 when we get to the Gemara. Okay. The next line simply says, if so, there will be no vow. Well, what does that mean? The problem is we don't know who is saying it. And there's a debate, even amongst Mishnaic scholars, as to who is saying this, and who is saying it radically affects the meaning. One school of thought says that Rabbi Zadok is saying this. And so Rabbi Zadok is saying, if we're going to loose a vow for a man by reason of honoring his parents, let's also loose it by reason of honoring Elohim. And then he goes on to say, if so, there will be no vows, meaning that Rabbi Zadok was actually opposing Rabbi Eliezer, and he was showing a flaw in his argument. He was saying that, as we would say, an argument that proves too much proves nothing at all. And so Rabbi Zadok is saying to Rabbi Eliezer, your argument proves nothing because we could also say we loose a vow by reason of the honor of Elohim, and if we did that, there wouldn't be any vows because they could all be loosed, right? Anytime, they'd all be subject to being invalidated easily. The other interpretation is that this phrase, there would be no vows, is the sages speaking to Rabbi Zadok. Okay? So that Eliezer says we loose a vow by reason of the honor of a mother or father. And Rabbi Zadok says, I agree with you. And not only that, I'll see your honor of a father and a mother, and I'll raise you the honor of Elohim. I'll say, so the Rabbi Zadok is saying, I agree with you, Rabbi Eliezer. And on top of that, I'll even go further and say that we should loose a vow for reference to Elohim, to the honor of Elohim. And then the sages then respond to both of them and say, you're nuts. You can't do that because if you did that, there wouldn't be any vows because every vow could be nullified. Okay. So then we get to the next line. This next line is very important. But the sages concede to Rabbi Eliezer that in a matter that is between him and his mother or father, they loose his vow by reference to his father or mother. In other words, if I was to say, become angry with my father or my mother, and say, anything of mine that might benefit you is korban. In other words, take a vow that nothing of mine might benefit my parents, that vow involves only 2 parties, me and my parent, right? And that kind of a vow, the Mishnah tells us, is not valid. You see that? Okay? Now, that's very important because isn't that the vow that Yeshua is talking about? That's specifically the vow that Yeshua addresses is the vow where a person says, anything of mine that might benefit my father is korban, is prohibited. And Yeshua says that kind of a vow is not valid, right? Right? And the sages say that kind of a vow is not valid, right here in the Talmud. Okay? Now, following the Talmud through, we go to the Gemara, because remember I told you that phrase, that little phrase, there would be no vows, has 4 different possible interpretations. And that's okay, because all 4 interpretations end up going to the same conclusion. Okay? The next interpretation is given in the Gemara by Rabbi Abai. In the Gemara it says, what is meant by there are no vows? Abai said, if so, vows are not properly revoked. Okay, what does that mean? We'll follow this through in a minute. Rabbah explained, if so, no one will seek a sage's absolution for his vow. Okay, so Abai is saying that the subject, the context of our Mishnah has to do with the loosing of vows. So we must keep the context in mind as we're reading the Mishnah. And so when it says there will be no vows, it's really meaning that there would be no loosing of vows, because that's the subject. Okay, so Abai is saying, if so, no vows would properly be revoked. Okay? And we'll explain why he says that in a minute. Rabbah says, now what it means is that there would be no vows because nobody would go seek a sage out to nullify his vow, because they'd all be so easily nullified. Okay, we learned, but the sages admit to Rabbi Eliezer that a matter concerning himself and his father and his mother, their honor is suggested as an opening. So the Gemara tells us that what we're going to do here is we're going to go to the conclusion that the Mishnah ultimately reaches, which, by the way, agrees with what Yeshua says, and we're going to test Rabbi Abai's position and Rabbi Rabbah's position and see if each of them are compatible with that conclusion, if they will lead to that conclusion if we interpret the text that way. And so, we first start with Abai's position. Abai's position is that no vows would be properly revoked. Now, why does he say that? Here's where it helps to have some of the ancient commentaries and also to have studied the Mishnah up to this point, which, of course, we have not. If we study the Mishnah up to this point, we learn what I actually told you earlier about how the person would be brought into the court and sat down, and the court would ask them, if you knew now what you knew then, would you still have made that vow? And the person has to honestly be able to testify that if they knew all the facts properly, if they knew everything then that they knew now, they wouldn't have made the vow. And Abai is saying this doesn't work, because if we talk about, there's 3 cases that are basically talked about. There's the case of the person that says, I want my vow loosed because it dishonors my parents that I made a vow. There's the person that says, I want my vow loosed because it dishonors Elohim that I made a vow. And the person who says, I want my vow loosed because it dishonors my parents and it doesn't really involve anybody but me and my parents. Nobody else is involved in the situation. Okay? So if we look at the situation where somebody, which is immediately in context, if we go back to our Mishnah, it says that if there would be no vows if a person was able to say, I want my vow loosed because it dishonors Elohim. So Abai says, what it's saying here is that no vows would be properly revoked, because can you really bring somebody into the court? And remember now, the rules of court, can you really bring somebody into court and say, would you have dishonored Elohim? If you had known then what you know now, would you have dishonored Elohim? Is anybody going to say, well, yeah, I don't really care about Elohim. I would have dishonored him. No, nobody's going to say that. You can't really reasonably expect anybody's going to say that. We have a similar kind of rule in court today where a defense attorney is not allowed Well, no attorney is actually allowed to ask a witness a question that he knows premeditatedly that the answer to that question will be a lie. In this case, the court cannot reasonably expect to get a real answer. And if the court can't get a real answer from the witnesses giving testimony, how can the court make a real determination? So the court can't make a real determination because the court can't really get to the bottom of it, because nobody is going to sit there and say, I would have dishonored Elohim. So that's what Rabbi Eli says. But his study partner, Rabbah, you see the two of these guys were study partners in the 3rd century. So they were good-natured buddies that would challenge each other. You know, iron sharpens iron, as we read in Proverbs. And so Abiah responds and says, the answer to that problem is, in other words, he's asked, how would we still get to this conclusion then? If in fact what you say is true, then why would a vow be loosed when it involves only a mother and a father? And Abiah says, and this is where it gets also difficult to understand, now Abiah, who explains it as meaning, if so, vows are not properly revoked. It is well here, since he has been so impudent, he is impudent. Now, you're like, what in the world does that mean? What Abiah is saying is that since he has been so impudent as to make a vow that on its face dishonored his parents. I mean, if I say anything to my father, if anything of mine that might benefit you is karban, that's dishonoring him on the face of it. Okay? There's no question then that I dishonored my father, because the very nature of that vow dishonors my father. So it's already on the table before we even get into court that I dishonored my father. So it then can be reasonably expected that the court could ask me if I would really make that vow if I'd known everything, and they could get a reasonable, honest answer from me, because there's no reason for me to try to hide that I took a vow that dishonored my father, because that's already out there. It's part of the case. So Rabbi Abiah says, it still comes to the same conclusion. Now, Rabbah has a different point of view. Rabbah says, if so, none will seek a sage's absolution for his vow. So Rabbah says, look, if any vow could be loosed simply by referencing the honor of Elohim, if anybody could just come into court and say, you know what, I want to be loosed from my vow because my vow, the fact that I took a vow dishonors Elohim, and so I want to be loosed from my vow by virtue of that. If they go to court and they say that, and they can be loosed, and it's guaranteed, and any vow could be said to dishonor Elohim, then why bother? Why go through the motions of going to court? So Abiah challenges Rabbah and says, why would anybody go to court and have their vow revoked? And Rabbah responds very simply and says, because they know the process, they know that in other situations they have to go to court to get their vow revoked. They will know they have to go to court to get this vow revoked as well. Okay, and so that's what it means when he says, I will tell you, since all other vows cannot be revoked without a sage, it will be offered as an opening here also. Okay, so now you've had little Talmud 101. You've actually examined an issue that's debated in Talmud all the way around. You see the 4 different possible interpretations of this little phrase here that's very pivotal. If so, there will be no vow. And you'll see how the Gemara and the Mishnah itself explore the fact that however you interpret that phrase, there will be no vow, you still get to the same conclusion that a vow that is between and only between a man and one of his parents, or I suppose a woman and one of her parents, a person and one of their parents, that dishonors their parents, is not valid and shouldn't be taken and is nullified. So we go back to Matthew chapter 15. Now you know and understand the issue that Yeshua is addressing. So let's go back and reread. We'll start verse 3. But he answered them and said, why do you transgress the commandments of Elohim by means of your decrees? Is it not written in your Torah from the mouth of Elohim, honor your father and your mother? And moreover written, and he that curses his father and his mother will surely die. But you say, whoever says to father and mother, it is all korban, whatever of mine might profit you or might benefit you. And he honors not his father and his mother. Thus have you made void the commandments of Elohim on account of your judgments. You hypocrites. Who is he speaking of? Who is he speaking of? Is he speaking of what are the traditions of men that he is speaking of? Are they the traditions of the Babylonian Talmud? No. He's agreeing with the Babylonian Talmud against what he calls the traditions of men. It's that simple. Anyone that says that Yeshua here, when he talks about the traditions of men, is criticizing the traditions of the Talmud, is ignorant of the contents of the Talmud. They haven't studied it. They're just making it up without even having done the rudimentary research to check it out to see if it's true. They just make it up. And you'll see Christian commentary after Christian commentary after Christian commentary that comes to that conclusion on Matthew chapter 15 because they don't even check. They just assume. Okay? So actually, Yeshua here is standing with the Talmud against traditions that disagree with the tradition that we find in the Talmud when he talks about the traditions of men. Not only that, what I find very interesting and hypocritical, if you will, is that Yeshua here in Matthew chapter 15 is engaging with other parties with a debate over whether or not such a vow is valid, isn't he? And he comes to the conclusion that such a vow is not valid because it violates the commandment to honor one's parents, right? The Talmud contains exactly the same debate in somewhat more detail, so you can actually understand Yeshua's words better now. See that? You can actually understand Yeshua's words better by studying the Talmud. You can actually understand Yeshua's words better now. Okay. Not only can you understand Yeshua's words better now, but Yeshua and the Talmud are saying the same thing, and Yeshua and the Talmud is also covering the same debate and coming to the same conclusion. So why does the Talmud get criticized and Yeshua get blessed, if you will, by the commentaries or whoever, commentators, when they're both doing exactly the same thing? Isn't that hypocrisy? Isn't that what's the word for it? A double standard? The double standard. Yeshua and the rabbis of the Talmud engage in the same debate over the same issues, come to the same conclusions, and Yeshua gets a free pass and the Talmud gets categorized as the traditions of men. It doesn't make sense. It's just bad scholarship. Okay? So, next time you hear somebody go traditions of men, and say, oh, you're all caught up in the traditions of men, you can, well, if you keep this handout, you can show them, if you can go through, remember forever what I told you today, it'll be on YouTube. You'll be able to go through and you'll be able to show them that no, Yeshua is agreeing with the Talmudic traditions in Matthew chapter 15 and criticizing those that reject those traditions as holding traditions of men. It's the other way around. It's exactly the opposite of what you've probably been told. Okay? All right. That's it for today. And next time I hope to maybe do some discussion of the time. So, Shua Tov, everyone.